are shared and you have a really interactive experience. Really over this first panel this afternoon, I'm going to make some introductory comments, get out of the way, and let the faculty talk about their experiences. This panel is experiences getting your first grant. That could be your first grant here at AU, it could have been your first grant at a prior university. But I think in starting this sort of discussion between the faculty here and the faculty out there, there's a lot of interactive opportunity to share your own experience in getting the first grant. I think you'll know from some of the comments earlier in the day that getting that first grant and getting into the funding stream is the critical component of this. Faculty that have been in the stream for 20 years know a lot of the ways to get those grants. But getting into the stream to begin with is the big hurdles, and you've seen some of the funding, the probabilities of success in getting grants. And so I'm very lucky here to have 4 faculty that are going to be talking about getting that first grant. We have Maria de Jesus, Assistant Professor in the School of International Service. We have Seth Gershonon on my immediate left, Assistant Professor, Department of Public Administration and Policy. Karen Morrissey on the far end, Assistant Professor, Department of Public Administration and Policy. And Michael Robinson, who's Assistant Professor, Department of Mathematics and Statistics. And so really at this point, the first question I want to pose to the group, and someone can jump right in, is maybe just talk a little bit about what getting that first grant was like.
Right on the line. Yeah. Do we need this really? Well, I'm speaking more clearly, so so the question was, how was it? And it was great. It was great to be able to buy research support in the summer. It's great to have extra money in the summer. So there's lots of sort of obvious, explicit, tangible reasons to go after this. But I think something else that I learned that I don't think I quite realized at first was I was sort of going after the money, and I knew that. But there was also some less tangible sort of benefits. And I noticed that like when I would go and present papers at conferences or seminars, having that slide on slide number 2 that says, thank you, this project was funded by so-and-so, blah, 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 it sort of gives extra credibility to the project and also to you as a junior scholar. And I found that to be especially useful, I guess, not being at Harvard, right? So that sort of extra credibility was really useful, I think, and sort of paved the way for future success.
So I don't, well, let's see, so I'm going to tell sort of 2 perspectives. One was the first grant proposal that I remember being involved in, because I started out actually in industry as a defense contractor. And I distinctly remember the first proposal that I was in. And then I'll talk about the first academic grant that I won. So the first grant proposal was actually as an industry engineer. And it's a different kind of world in the way that academia works, but it was very enlightening, it was very useful. I distinctly remember it because I had set up a trip to go talk with people that would be our collaborators. And it was going to be a meeting that I was going to go meet with them. And 2 days before, I got appendicitis and ended up in the hospital. And remember, after everything got taken care of, I came out of the hospital, and my wife was like, well, I guess that trip that you were going to take is off. And I said, but this seemed like kind of fun. It was a new experience. I'm really interested. I'd really love to go, but I have no idea how I'm going to get there because the doctor said I couldn't drive. She said, well, fine. You know what? I wanted to kind of go that direction anyway, so I'll drive you. So there I was, just basically off anesthetic, and went to this meeting to write a proposal. Now, we didn't win, but what that particular encounter that I had while writing the proposal really got me thinking about is another intangible benefit of writing proposals, that it really gets ideas, initial ideas out on paper, makes them very concrete. You say, oh, this is something real in that I want to do these specific objectives. These are the goals. This is what we're going to do to get those goals. And anything else. Now, in the end, we didn't win that particular proposal. And so now let me go down several more years down the chain, where I was a postdoc and had been doing defense contracting on the side, kind of was involved with the proposal process, and told my supervisor, you know what, I want to write a proposal myself for me as your postdoc, because it just seems like the right thing to do. And furthermore, what I found was that there was a good sponsor who was already very supportive of this idea and was very interested, and kind of walked me through what was the thing that I would need to do. Now, we went ahead, did this whole process, and this exposed me to the other intangible, perhaps not benefit, but something to be aware of associated with grants is that it takes a lot of logistics. Once you've gotten the grant, there's a lot of paperwork, especially if you're dealing with the federal government, as I exclusively do. It was a very interesting experience managing this, especially because I got the phone call from the sponsor saying, hey, I'm going to write you an award document, but you're a postdoc, so this is a little weird, what do I do? And it was at that point that I had already accepted my offer to come here at AU. So before I could even actually make use of the money that I had gotten, I had to deal with the fact of transferring it to another institution. And that was, again, a logistically very interesting experience. But then all the tangible benefits that Seth just alluded to flowed out of that. And that was a very good experience. And so it's been a matter of, and this has been my students tell me this all the time, that I'm always running around crazy managing logistics. But on the other hand, it's really worth it. And you get good ideas out quickly. That's where a lot of the creative thought happens in the process of writing proposals. So I don't find them onerous, even if I know I've got a low probability of winning. You get a lot out of it.
Okay, hi everybody. So experience with first grant. I would say for me, it was about following my idea. Not necessarily finding the mechanism first, but finding my idea, getting as much feedback, as I was mentioning to Dr. Pollack, I don't know if he's still in the room, yes. Getting as much feedback as possible, different sets of eyes, both academic, non-academic eyes, to look at it, give me as much feedback as possible, create a convincing, strong, concise proposal, and then start worrying about the mechanisms. And I think that actually did have a lot of benefits as well. First, I convinced myself that this was worthwhile to pursue as an idea. I was then more likely to convince other people that this was a really important idea that I thought needed to be looked at, needed to be explored, needed to be researched, hence why I need the funding to do this. And then thirdly, I was able to figure out who in the field, as far as the funding field is concerned, would be most likely to like the idea, either because this was an area that they had identified or general area that this research proposal fit into that they had identified already as a priority, or that it fit generally enough into the mission, the scope of their vision, that I think I would have a good shot at it. So my number one thing was follow my idea and become passionate about it, write it in a strong, convincing way, get feedback to refine it because it is a really different way of writing, and then convince the rest of the world, including the funders, that it's a worthwhile idea.
The beauty of speaking last is that I echo what the others have said, and my personal first grant experience was in grad school, which I was fortunate to have a mentor who really encouraged external funding, and it was great because in grad school you have, you realize now you have the luxury of more time, practice, and so I had a grant that funded my dissertation, and then I also went through and applied for a postdoc through NIH, and so I had the experience of working with very bureaucratic, lots of paperwork, lots of logistics during a time when I wasn't a junior faculty member. But then since coming to AAU, I'll completely agree that while the funded grants have been wonderful for tangibles. The not funded ones have been really great to generate new ideas. If you submit a proposal and you get reviewer feedback, that is extremely, extremely valuable. I enjoy writing proposals because I think of an idea and it's like a problem to solve, right? And the proposal is exactly how you're going to solve that problem. What data set are you going to use? What analytic approach are you going to take? You have to be really specific and convince somebody that you're going to do it and that it's important. And being concise and detailed, the right level of detail, I guess I should say, are really important. But I agree, starting with the idea and then figuring out where might be best suited, I think is a good approach. And also, once you have a few proposals out there, even if they don't hit, you get a sense for who funds what might be the most appropriate for what. You get invited to review grant proposals, which I have found extremely helpful. I think it cascades in several different ways.
Well, I think maybe one follow-up, and Taryn just touched on it, and that's the psychology of rejection. Because in my experience, at least from the central administration standpoint, some faculty, especially if they're fairly new, they get that first rejection, and they don't write a grant for another 5 years. So maybe if the other three, maybe you could touch maybe upon the mindset of that, and maybe take a step further and say, what could we do here at AU to help in those scenarios? And I'd be curious.
I think it's about perseverance. So there is a psychology of rejection. I think there's also a psychology of perseverance. No one likes rejection, either personal or professional. But once one is able to digest it, and that usually does take, X amount of time, you fill in the blank, hopefully not 5 years, because the idea is to develop a thick skin and not to personalize it. But when you are good and ready to actually go back and not just skim the feedback, hopefully you would have had feedback, but to really take line by line, take it line by line and take it seriously and see what you agree with and what you may disagree with, to then go back and make it better. Because I think, again, going back to this idea, if one believes in the idea, then you don't let it go, right? You pursue it. And part of it might be figuring out whether it was the right mechanism. There are several factors why it might have been rejected. It might not have been the right mechanism. Hopefully, if you would have done that homework and really, gone through that process, it would have been the right mechanism. But that is always a possibility. Or it might have been the right mechanism and that particular area, for whatever reason, wasn't being prioritized. But sort of taking a step back and trying to objectively look at the feedback, get feedback from others in relation to that feedback from the reviewers, I think is also important, because a different set of objective eyes is also helpful in figuring out, what is actually legitimate feedback and what you think, well, this may or may not fit. As far as what the university could do, I think writing a proposal can be somewhat isolating. I would even say even with collaborative proposals, because people are so focused on their particular area. And I think providing a forum whereby people could really get that real feedback, right? The feedback that actually will produce a better product, a better proposal in the end, is very useful. And in that, it means to create a community of scholars that are supportive, but that are also interested in ensuring your success, and vice versa. And I think that those forums are rare to find. I think a lot of us have forums where we could potentially get some feedback, but they're not necessarily the feedback that one needs, or for whatever reason. I think mostly because the forum is not made up of people who you truly can feel comfortable with, to go back and forth with, and to get that feedback to make it a stronger proposal. So I think more than anything, it's creating that informal community and then formalize that forum where you have those community members attend and provide feedback and then provide structure to that process.
So one of the things that I've thought of, in addition to the technical merit or the structural merit of the proposal, one of the other things that I found is a realization when a proposal gets rejected is sometimes it's a good idea. Maybe it's even well thought out and well presented, just the wrong funder at the wrong time. The opinions and needs of sponsors are not the opinions and needs of the academic community. And it's really important to see whether or not maybe it's a good idea, maybe you've got it. I know this happened to me where it was a fine proposal. It was just to someone who actually didn't have money. They were anticipating having money. They put out a solicitation and, well, it turns out that things changed and they were no longer interested in that problem. They didn't have money for anyone. So being aware of that landscape is very important. And being able to assess what that landscape is that's a tough job, and that's something that I think really involves getting your feet on the ground and exploring. It's possibly something that the university could be involved in, but it also really involves having you specifically make connections with sponsors to say who is actually interested in what, when, and why, so that you can fill the needs, in particular, fill needs that they haven't thought of, but when they read them, they say, ah, yes, this is something we need. And being able to identify that is something that is crucial to getting the proposal accepted. And more often than not, in my case, it's been a matter of, well, yeah, it was fine, and the feedback was like, this is fine, it's just we're not interested in this right now, sorry. And that's kind of a downer, but on the other hand, that is the financial reality of things.
So I think my first proposal that was funded was rejected 3 times, and it was also rejected at a conference, just as a conference paper. And that hurt my feelings, but I was a fresh PhD in my first year at AU. But I sort of, I thought it was a good paper, and it was a good idea. And the 4th time was a charm, and it did get funded, and then it did eventually get into other conferences and published and everything. And it's just like we're getting rejected from a journal, right? And you're aiming high, you're aiming for a good journal. If anything, I think that the grant game is better in the sense that you can submit to multiple funders at once, unlike journals usually. So sort of once I got the hang of that, now I have my 3 or 4 sort of go-to funders, and the proposal formats are similar enough that it's sort of silly not to, because you just, change the headers or whatever to fit the format for the different funders and send them out. And then the other thing is just, at this point, for journals and grants, I expect to be rejected, right? And I think that's the right attitude, because then you can be extra happy when it doesn't get rejected. But that only works if you're sort of careful in how you spend your time. So I have a rule for myself that I will not write a grant proposal for a project that I wouldn't do even if it's not funded in some other state of the world. And I'm a social scientist, so I don't need to spend lots and lots of money on labs and things like that. But following some sort of rough rule like that, I think is useful. Because then you don't, I think when you get in trouble is when you sort of chase the money for half-baked ideas that you're not even that interested in. And if you take that approach, then the upshot of getting rejected but still doing the project is you already wrote this 5 or 10 or 20-page proposal, and that's really the rough draft for your paper, which you were going to do anyway since you're going to do it anyway. So I think just sort of expect it and deal with it and get used to it, and that's life.
Any questions from the audience?
running with that idea, I'm Sheryl Lowinger, by the way, I worked with a couple of you on proposals. And running with that thought, one of the things that when I meet with the new faculty, they say to me, well, where do I apply? What do I do? And we have these online tools, but one thing I've heard all four of you say is finding the right funder. So I kind of have two questions. One, as a new faculty member, how long did it take you? And two, what did you do to find that right program officer or that right person or opportunity? And did you get a lot of support within AU, or did you get a lot of support from people you'd worked with previously? So what was your method in finding those right sponsors to go to or those right opportunities?
For me, I found it was really useful to look at the CVs of associate professors who I wanted to become in 5 years. I think that AU has a lot of sort of interdisciplinary departments, and I'm in one, and that makes it a little bit hard for sort of high-level administrators to target potential funders to you. So this is a case where I think it's really on you as an individual to sort of figure out what works for your field. And I think that the CV search idea sort of works for a lot of ways other than just funding, right? It helps for conferences and journals and so on. And then just searching around. I'm in education, I'm an economist by training. There's a lot of directions I could go. There's people that fund mostly econ, there's people that fund ed policy, there's people that fund sort of inequality, sort of diversity issues. And if you have a thick skin, you just sort of send them everywhere and you sort of learn who likes what you do and who doesn't. There's one funder that rejects me every time, and I'm slowly coming around to thinking that they don't like economists as much as they like sociologists. And I think that's sort of just how it goes. But I don't think that they're annoyed when I send them something. And I'm not too upset when I get rejected. But the other thing I'll say for junior people is I think when I first got here, at least, there was sort of a push to apply for the big time, like NSF and NIH stuff. And in my case, I had no funding experience in grad school or anything, and I was a fresh PhD with no publications. And I just sort of intuitively knew that NSF wasn't going to give this random new person money. So I really targeted smaller money funders at first, and then once you sort of have a track record of a couple solo publications and a couple smaller grants, now I'm comfortable like applying to NIH or NSF.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Looking at other people's CVs, it's what I tell students, when they're saying, well, how do I figure out my career trajectory or what I want to do? I'm like, well, pick a job, find somebody who has the job you want, see what they've done. And that's kind of the same thing for funding or publishing in journals. And I also completely agree with starting small, not necessarily just small, but I do food and security research, and so there are several smallish grants funded by USDA through poverty centers, for example, that I've had success with. And there is still federal funding, but they're not huge burdens in NIH grants, which I've also applied for. And those are, I think, much more time-consuming, but they're of a different value because you often have collaborators with you, too. And in my case, they were senior collaborators, and so I learned a lot. Even, my postdoc funding was successful from NIH, but the I think 5 other times I've submitted to NIH have not been successful. So I've submitted 15 grant applications since coming to AU, and 5 have been successful. So I've gotten used to being rejected, and many of those papers I've done anyways. And actually, they're not 15 different papers, because they're recycled. Changing the headers is a really good thing. But I think researching who in your field is doing similar work, who do you cite, right? Look at the journal articles you're reading, and then see what acknowledgements, who's funding that, I think is a really useful way.
I also think in combination with talking with senior people within your field or fields is helpful, as well as belonging to larger network, online listservs, networks, because in some ways they're already a step ahead. So as opposed to you going out and searching here and there, potential funders, if you belong to these listserv networks online, they've already sort of conglomerated all the potential funders that are out there, any mechanisms that are available at the time. And so sifting through those and figuring out, does this fit? Let me do a little more homework on this one. This is not for me, move on. OSP as well, I think belonging to the listserv, internal listserv at AU, where they send you information about what's available. And there are ways of tailoring the searches so that, instead of going through everything that's out there, you can tailor it to specific areas, disciplines, keywords that you're particularly interested in.
So that's an important point about looking into the networks. And I also would say that one thing that's been very valuable to me is actually realizing that, well, funders are professionals too, and they have their own professional networks, they have their own conferences. If you go to those conferences, you get a very quick idea of what the landscape is like. So I've gone to a number of conferences where people that I'm interested in getting funding from are at, and it's their game. So I haven't presented, just going to listen. And then once you meet people there, I think the other thing that's been very valuable, especially in my space, which is primarily the defense intelligence world, has been to actually go talk to the funders directly. Get on their schedule, show up, talk to them, see what's really of interest to them, hear what their difficult problems are, problems that no one could solve, whether they're at Harvard or anyone else. Those are places where you want to sharpen your pencil, so to speak, and see if you can attack those problems. On the other hand, this takes a while. And Shira, you had asked, how long does it take in order to build a network? And, well, I don't really actually know. I've been at this for a while, well before I came here. But it's important to know specifically who's interested and who they're connected to, because I've had the situation where one person did not fund me, but he had passed a proposal around. And someone else saw it and said, hey, I don't want exactly that thing, but I'm really interested in, why don't you write me a proposal on something else? And that's turned out very well. So getting a personal connection with the funders is really very, very helpful.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, I'll throw one out then. Maybe you can speak to the whole relationship between getting grants, generating knowledge, and converting that into the classroom, making the classroom experience, the teaching experience better. So maybe can you tie in the whole thought of the balance between research teaching, how research can improve classroom knowledge and teaching with students, and maybe tie that in with the whole idea of getting your first grant.
So I'll take that. I think one thing that's been helpful, since a lot of the work I do is kind of hands-on data wrangling, as well as even sometimes physical equipment wrangling. Kind of try to play the role of not quite engineer, but kind of engineer, so I do build equipment to test out ideas. This turns out to be helpful on the research side. Of course, this is great for writing publications, but then that's something I can just pick up and bring into the classroom, and I do. It also helps not just in the classroom, but also once you've got the resources to build up a research group. I do a lot of my time is teaching the students in my research group. Those same students end up in my classes as well, and they bring a useful perspective to the discussions that happen in the classroom. So that now these are students that will hear, say, if I'm applying some particular topic from an area of mathematics that I'm using in my research, my research group students have seen that topic, and now when it shows up on the syllabus, that's something they know about and they can bring to the discussion as well from their perspective.
I think also a lot of the funders really like to see doctoral students or grad student RAs involved. And it's really win-win for you because odds are your dean wants you to have your doctoral students involved in co-authoring and RAs and things. And they're cheap labor, and they help you get the project done, and they get good experience for doing it on their own later. So I think, and our department only teaches grad students, so I guess sort of bringing this stuff into the classroom is a little bit, it's different in a sense because a lot of them are just really interested in sort of doing policy analysis and program evaluation and research in the first place. So it's sort of trivial to do that, but just involving them in the grant, mentioning in the grant proposal that, two master's students or 2 PhD students will be hired in the summer and blah, 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 they'll do this. And then when you're writing sort of the benefits of the project, in addition to all these policy implications and furthering knowledge and so on, you're also furthering the career of the next generation of scholars.
I'll just add, I do see the value of bringing research into the classroom. I think a lot of our students, both undergraduates and graduates, don't necessarily see themselves as researchers. It's sort of this big thing over there, and I can't identify with it. So bringing in one's research, I think enriches the learning experience and also gets them interested to begin inquiring and potentially become a research assistant once the class is over, to get involved in grant writing, proposal writing, which obviously will increase their grant-making skills, grant writing skills, as well as potential co-authors in publications, primary data collectors, whatever talents they already bring to the table can sort of be enhanced and then learn new skills. So I think bringing in one's research into the learning classroom is very valuable. As well as once you're talking about your research, getting all these different perspectives allows one to think about the questions in a different way and potentially shapes and informs how you ultimately propose it to a funder. So I think it's valuable all around.
Yeah, and in theory, writing the narrative and proposal should force you to get really up to date on a specific issue, which you can bring into the classroom too and talk about cutting edge issues and policy. I teach in a policy department too, so it's, in our case it's cutting edge policy issues or what's going on in the existing space, but that's the same for other areas of research too.
Let me tag off to something you said, Maria, where the students don't necessarily get the perspective of being a researcher. One thing that's very useful to put into your grants is the funding to send students on travel to go to conferences, because then they can get the experience of saying, hey, I presented something I did on this project. They take ownership of it. They present it to the community. They get the feedback from the community. They feel like they're part of it. And that can get them very excited. I've had a number of students who have gone out and presented and come back and said, wow, this was amazing.
We've heard a little bit about how grant writing is sort of its own animal in terms of the style. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what adjustments you had to make from, say, how you would write for your academic audience and when you're writing for a grant proposal.
I could start. It's much briefer and much more concise. And I think, as has been said earlier, you're convincing somebody rather than defending an approach, if that makes sense. So I used to work on the Hill and then in policy, so I have, I like writing more policy memos. I like trying to convince somebody, so I have other areas of experience in that, fortunately. But I incorporated in my classroom too very, very strict page limits, be concise. And I was talking about this earlier about how it's all about saving your reader time. It takes much longer to write a one-page memo than it does to write a 4-page memo. And the first time I did it, it took me 2 days. But it's really valuable. Students hate page limits. I hate page limits, but I find them, there's a use for them. And so I don't know how you get better at it other than practicing, frankly, but I think pure review is great, and especially from somebody who's knowledgeable and who's I guess knowledgeable in terms of being a researcher or academic themselves, but maybe isn't steeped in your area, is probably the best person to read your proposal, I would venture, because they know the general idea, but not the details, and so they can pick apart, well, this probably isn't necessary, or what did you mean by this? And so, but just like public speaking, I think it's a practice, and that's why casting a wide net is often good too.
I would say the main difference is also, it's about framing. You're framing that written proposal in a way that could convince, not to overuse that word, but it is about convincing your audience, in this case your funders. And convincing means that you have to provide citations, other people in the field. If it's a funder that's particularly interested in interdisciplinary work, then you want to make sure that you're really doing an exhaustive, comprehensive lit search to make sure your citations reflect that, providing statistical information if you can, quantitative. If one has pilot data to substantiate the proposal, I think all the better. So that's what I sort of mean by frame. And then the concision, I've been writing for too long. The part about making it concise, is concision a word? It is not. The precision and getting it right, the tweaking of it happens as you rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. But I think the main idea for me anyway is about what is the larger frame, and then the rest gets tweaked through the feedback and the details come in afterwards.
So in terms of being concise, I think that's definitely important. I had a senior colleague tell me that the person who you'd like to convince should be able to make some kind of informed decision, not a perfectly informed decision, but some kind of informed decision within the first paragraph, preferably within the first 2 sentences. Now, that's a tough goal and that's unreasonable, but that's sort of what you should be aiming for. Another sort of very concrete thing that's very helpful, again, I came from the engineering world, everything's concrete, but very helpful and a good piece of advice is there was an old director of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and what he had said was, every time a proposal crosses my desk, I will not read it unless it answers a certain set of questions. These are called the Heilmeyer questions. You can Google it. And the Heilmeyer questions answer such things as, what are you trying to do? Why? Who cares? How much is it going to cost? Very basic things. You hit those, and those are the kind of things that you need to say. Gives you a very short list, very concrete, but also helps you to be very concise. You answer those in the first few pages, great. Answer it in the first paragraph, that's more or less.
And I'll just say the last big difference for me is I'm, I guess, more shameless and more normative than I would be in an academic journal article. Most of my luck has been with private foundations that have a mission. So one funder, they change their mission every couple of years, and their current mission is reducing inequality. So I write stuff that I would never write in a million years in a journal article about how bad inequality is and how this mechanism might be producing inequality or perpetuating inequality and da-da-da. And that's one way of framing what would otherwise be a fairly positive analysis of a school intervention. And I really, once you sort of get over feeling guilty about maybe not being like a true scientist, maybe, or whatever, maybe that's just me, but once I got over it, I sort of liked it and enjoyed sort of writing that way. And I'm probably also a little more repetitive, because just the structure of the proposal, there's like the intro where you have to state the problem, and then you come back to the problem, and the policy implications, you have to hit them with the policy implications 3 different times. So concise, but also repetitive, so there's sort of a balance, I guess.
So let me speak to the repetitiveness. One of the things that does happen on the review side is that sometimes proposals will get sliced apart. And the reason for the repetitiveness sometimes is that different people are reading those different sections. So you want that repetitiveness because you're trying to talk to different people. And sometimes, even though they might seem like the sections are saying, say exactly what you said in the previous section, it's usually a slightly different spin. And it's important to be aware of that.
So I have a question about, setting it up, you described 2 very different ways of trying to fit what you're working on with the interests of foundations or funding agencies. One of them was Michael's, in which he actually goes to conferences and spends time at foundations getting a feel for what they're interested in. And the other is just doggedly submitting proposals to various folks in St. Bites. Have any of you had experiences dialoguing sort of maybe in less costly ways than what Michael's described, but to sort of get a feel for what people really are interested in funding, and have you cater to what you are proposing to foundations as in response?
Yeah, I've talked to NIH program officers too, and that's been extremely helpful because they're not the ones making the decisions about what proposals are funded, but they're there for the conversations, and they know sort of what ideas are coming down, what the study section talked about last time, what problems they find in proposals, but also kind of the big questions that are remaining. So that's been helpful. And then where I've had more luck with funding is, as I mentioned, from poverty centers or specific funders related to food insecurity and obesity issues, health issues. Looking at what they funded last year is really a quick and dirty way of doing it. The calls for proposals have themes usually in what I've submitted to, and they're usually pretty broad themes, but you have to hit on it. And often they specify with more detail in the call for proposals, and I think making sure that your idea fits within that is vital, but then also maybe taking cues from what they've funded previously is useful.
So since you called out that I spend a lot of time doing this, which is true, the other thing that I do a lot of is I spend a lot of time on the phone. So rather than specifically traveling, once I've been to a conference, now I've got a Rolodex full of people talking, and I do hound them. And I find that's a much more efficient use of time to call up most of these program managers that I end up bothering consistently. That's what their job is to talk to people that they need to fund. So they're usually quite happy to do that. And I find that's a really good way that it'll come up in conversation that, oh, I don't really have an interest in that specific thing, but hey, you know what, why don't you call up so-and-so? That sort of networking is very valuable.
Any other questions? Well, I think maybe in moving toward a wrap-up here, I think maybe a question for each of you in closing is, can you share a couple takeaways with everyone here today as to your best takeaways in getting grants, the first time?
Or mistakes that you would avoid.
Or to avoid.
I think, well, as Seth said, I think being wary about spending too much time working on funding proposals is really important. I get really excited about new ideas, and I've gone down paths that I haven't visited before, and so those ideas have died. I wouldn't say that they're not useful, but you know, it was a lot of hours put into it that looking back maybe I wouldn't have done. So kind of charting a course of what you want your research to look like, and then figuring out what funding opportunities might fit that, rather than the other way around, is useful. And realizing that even something rejected might not be the end of the line, and it's a useful exercise, especially if you get reviewer comments. If you don't get reviewer comments, sometimes you can ask for them, and you know, usually people are interested that you want to improve, so they're usually pretty willing to help.
I would say one major tip is start that process early, that process we were talking about of networking. It's not, for me anyway, about finding the person after I find the mechanism, but even before finding the mechanism. Figuring out, you know, project officers, contact information, contacting them, being perseverant there too, because sometimes you don't get the right person, and so it's about one door closing and trying another door. But talking to people, I think, also gives you that sort of feel for the landscape of what's out there, and then potentially being referred to another mechanism or another officer that would be helpful, especially in the foundation world, I think. But this happens also with government funding and NIH, where institute project officers talk to each other and pass on proposals, if you're lucky. And certainly within the foundation world, you know, I've had situations where Russell Sage Foundation says, oh, you should be talking to this person at this foundation as well, given your area of research in global public health. And I wouldn't have known that had I not talked to that person. So phone conversations are really helpful, but start early, I would say.
First and foremost, be ready to invest some time into this. It does take time, and if you get into it, you know, there's the other side, which is that it can become a lot of fun, and then start to eclipse other activities. So be aware that it takes a long time. The second thing is to make sure that you do your networking, do your homework, do it early. Most of the places where I've run into a definite, yeah, I made a mistake on this one, was that I hadn't done my homework properly. I pitched to the wrong person, the wrong time. I've even had it where someone was very excited, was ready to fund it, and then got reassigned to another office. That sort of thing happens. So be ready to spend time, be ready to network, make sure you're ready to do that. And then remember, this is actually part of the research enterprise, and have fun.
Yeah, I think just do it early and often, and it just takes one to get funded, and that's huge for your career. So, and the review's long enough that you send it out, and then you can get it off your desk and go on with your life, and then a couple months later, you know, either revisit it or hopefully it gets funded. But there's nothing to be scared of, no reason to put it off or postpone it. It's not going to be perfect, so it's just, like, don't hold on to it for too long. Don't send out a shoddy draft either. There's some, like, I don't know, range of acceptable submissions, and good luck.
Thank you very much.